Power has a temperature. Valerius Thorne had learned this truth in back-alley negotiations and boardroom massacres. True power runs cold, controlled, absolute. His life existed in temperatures, the ice in his whiskey, the chill of his marble floors, the frozen calculation behind every decision that built his criminal empire. Emotion was heat, heat was chaos, chaos was death. The nursery was the only warm room in his estate. Not because of the temperature, Val's security team maintained a precise 68 degrees throughout the property, but because of what lived there. 3 impossible, fragile creatures who'd arrived 6 months ago and complicated everything. Isla with her serious gray eyes, Lyra with her persistent grip, Stella with her crooked smile. His daughters, the result of one night. One rare moment of weakness with a woman who'd disappeared before he could decide what to do about it, leaving only a note and 3 positive pregnancy tests. He'd built walls within walls to protect them, hired the best nanny agencies, installed military-grade locks, kept them sequestered from his business, from his enemies, from himself. Because the moment anyone knew Valerius Thorne cared about something, that something became a target. This morning, the walls failed. Alara Cruz, the maid who'd been with his household for 2 years, vetted, background checked, monitored, stumbled into his private study looking like she'd seen a massacre. Her cap sat crooked on her dark hair, her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and when she spoke her voice carried the weight of catastrophe. "Sir." The triplets didn't wake up. The words hung between them like smoke from a gun. Val moved. Not the measured stride of a boss reviewing territory, but the lethal sprint of a predator whose den has been invaded. The hallway blurred. The nursery door, reinforced steel disguised as oak, stood ajar. Inside, everything looked perfect, pristine, exactly as it should be, except for the 3 porcelain dolls arranged in cribs where his daughters should be breathing. Each doll wore one of their nightgowns. Each doll faced the door, as if watching for his arrival. Valerius Thorne, who'd stared down federal prosecutors and rival kingpins without flinching, felt his carefully constructed world fracture. His whisper emerged raw, dangerous, barely human. "Where are they?" And for the first time in 20 years, he felt heat. Val's hand shot out, gripping the nearest crib rail hard enough that his knuckles went white against the dark ink covering them. The serpent tattooed across his right forearm seemed to writhe as his muscles tensed. He forced himself to look, really look, at what had been left behind. The dolls weren't random. They were custom-made, expensive, each with hand-painted features that eerily resembled his daughter's. Isla's doll had the same serious expression. Lyra's had tiny fists clenched the same way. Stella's mouth curved in that familiar crooked shape. Someone had been watching, studying, planning. Security footage. Val's voice had returned to its usual lethal calm, but Alara could see the tremor in his jaw. Now. 20 minutes later, they stood in his private office, screens flickering with 12 different camera angles. Val's fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, rewinding, fast-forwarding, searching for the ghost who'd breached his fortress. Nothing. Every camera showed normal operations, guards rotating on schedule, delivery trucks arriving and departing through proper channels. The night nanny, Mrs. Chen, leaving at her usual 6 a.m. departure time. Alara entering the nursery at 6:30. Everything exactly as it should be. No forced windows, no picked locks, no masked figures scaling walls. Val's hand slammed against the desk hard enough to crack the wood veneer. They're inside. They've always been inside. He turned to Alara with such sudden intensity that she took an involuntary step back. His eyes, usually the color of frozen steel, now burned with something primitive and terrifying. "Tell me again. Every detail, every person you saw, every sound you heard." Alara's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. She'd seen men interrogated in this office, seen them break, seen them carried out in pieces, but she squared her shoulders and spoke clearly. "I checked them at 6:30. Isla was on her back, Lyra on her side, Stella on her stomach like always. They were breathing. I heard Stella make those little cooing sounds. I went downstairs to the kitchen, prepared 3 bottles, warmed them to exactly 98 degrees. I was gone maybe 12 minutes. When I came back, who did you see in those 12 minutes? Mrs. Chen was leaving through the side entrance. Marcus was at the east gate. The cook hadn't arrived yet. She paused and Val's entire body tensed like a drawn bowstring. What? I saw someone. One of the cleaning staff, but I didn't recognize him. He had a uniform, the right credentials hanging from his belt, but his face was… She closed her eyes, forcing the memory into focus. He was carrying something, a bag, black canvas, the kind the laundry service uses. Val was already moving, pulling up employee files, cross-referencing with the morning's security logs. We don't have cleaning staff on Tuesday mornings, ever. The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Elara's breath caught. The West Service entrance. He was near the West Service entrance, the one that leads to the old wine cellar. Val's eyes snapped to hers. That entrance has been sealed for 3 years. The latch. Elara's voice gained strength, certainty replacing fear. When I passed by it last week, I noticed the dust had been disturbed. I meant to report it, but I thought maybe it was just Marcus doing his rounds, checking the seals. Val was already at the door, and Elara found herself following, no longer the frightened maid, but something else entirely, a co-conspirator, an ally, perhaps the only person in this entire estate he could trust. "Show me," he said, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elara led him through the kitchen, past the pantry to a narrow corridor most of the staff didn't even know existed. At the end stood an old wooden door, painted over so many times it seemed part of the wall itself. Val pressed his palm against it. It swung open with barely a whisper. The latch mechanism had been freshly oiled. The hinges showed recent tool marks, and on the floor, almost invisible against the dark stone, was a single pink bootie, the kind his daughters wore. Someone had walked out of his home carrying everything that mattered, and they'd done it through a door that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Valerius was not a man accustomed to begging or even asking. He was accustomed to demanding and receiving. Yet here he was, locked in the soundproof confines of his study, the faint, sickening scent of the children's perfume still clinging to the air, dialing a number he'd sworn years ago to delete. The connection was cold, humming with a static that felt like judgment. A voice answered, smooth as polished obsidian, dripping with the confidence of a man who held every card. This was Marco Vetti, a rival from the old San Diego circuit, a man Valerius had successfully pushed into the shadow economy years ago by exposing a vulnerability in Vetti's cash flow. "Valerius," Vetti drawled, the name a casual insult on his tongue. "To what do I owe this historical intrusion?" Valerius bypassed the pleasantries, his voice a low, compressed rumble that usually froze men in their tracks. "My daughters, they've been taken. I need the name of the man who organized the hit inside my house." A soft, amused laugh echoed across the line. "Taken? Oh, Val, the great fortress of Thorn compromised, predictable eventually. And what does the Thorn Empire offer in trade for information, A simple name comes at a platinum price." Valerius hesitated. He saw the empty cribs behind his eyes. He heard Elara's fearful gasp. He thought of the immense, cold power he'd spent his life building. He knew Vetti would demand the most damaging secret he possessed, the location and content of the Cerberus ledger, the only hard-copy documentation that linked Thorn to a decade of untraceable political corruption, currently secured in a vault beneath Lake Michigan. Releasing it would cripple his untouchable status and expose him to multiple jurisdictions. "The ledger," Valerius ground out, tasting ash. "The Cerberus ledger. You get the location and the access code. You have 24 hours to collect it. After that, the deal is void." There was a long, luxurious pause from Vetti. "Such a beautiful sacrifice, Val. You have certainly matured in your desperation. Give me 10 minutes. The line went dead. Valerius dropped the phone onto the desk. He felt the sickening lurch of the earth moving beneath him. He had just voluntarily amputated a limb of his empire, sacrificing years of strategic security for a name. It was the first true evidence of his priorities shifting, a choice the old Valerius would never have made. The old Valerius would have sent men to burn Vetti's operation to the ground first. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed. It was a single, encrypted text from Vetti. Silvio Corsi, he's been patient, Val, and revenge is a meal best served cold and triple-sized. Valerius knew the name. Silvio, a former associate and arms procurer, whom Valerius had framed and stripped of everything when he discovered Silvio's private skimming operation 5 years prior. Silvio hadn't died in the ensuing chaos. He had just disappeared, nursing a vendetta. Silvio, Valerius whispered. The name sharp and dangerous. It wasn't about turf or money. It was personal. It was blood, and that made the rescue infinitely more dangerous. Valerius had left the estate in a dark, unmarked S-Class sedan, but not with his usual complement of heavily armed bodyguards. Instead, he drove, and his only passenger was Alara. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken tension, the sterile black leather of the interior mirroring the distance between them. It was a dynamic that had fundamentally shattered. He was no longer the all-powerful master, and she was no longer the invisible servant. They were two people united by a single, desperate, fragile priority. Silvio Corsi is smart, Valerius stated, his voice tight, focused entirely on the road ahead. He wouldn't bring them to a known safe house. He needs cover. And he needs to taunt me. Alara finally spoke, the fear still coloring her voice but overlaid now with a strange, nervous certainty. I worked for a cleaning service before I came to the Thorns, sir, down in the Iron Coast district near the old shipyard. It's been derelict for years. But it has tunnels, connecting the warehouses under the freight line. Valerius glanced sharply at her, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had maps of this city, digitized and cross-referenced with every utility line and criminal enterprise, yet she spoke of tunnels his security division was unaware of. You know the Iron Coast? Alara shifted, her hands clenching in her lap. Her elegant maid uniform, so carefully starched hours earlier, now seemed a ridiculous disguise. I know the Iron Coast, sir. Before this house, before the apron, I lived there. It's where people go when they want to disappear, and where people go when they can't afford to live anywhere else. Her eyes, usually lowered in subservience, met his in the rearview mirror. They were sharp, intelligent, and held a depth of experience that belied her quiet demeanor. He made the turn, leaving the manicured boulevards of his usual path for the crumbling asphalt of the industrial fringe. The streetlights thinned out, replaced by the flickering, sickly yellow glow of ancient sodium lamps. Alara began giving directions, her words clipped and precise, detailing back alleys, blocked-off service roads, and crumbling piers that were shortcuts only locals, or those deeply entrenched in the city's shadows, would know. There's an old signal box near the rail yard, she directed. It hasn't been used in 30 years, but the power still runs to a few auxiliary sheds. Silvio needs power for heat, even for a few hours. That's where we look first. This was knowledge gained not from a corporate brief, but from survival. It was the lexicon of poverty and crime, the city's true underbelly that Valerius's money had always kept him insulated from. He realized, with a creeping shame, that Alara, his humble maid, was currently more valuable than his entire security team. He was being guided through his own territory by a phantom he'd never bothered to see. They finally pulled into the abandoned warehouse district, a graveyard of rust and concrete on the edge of the docks. The silence here was different, not the controlled silence of his estate, but a heavy, dangerous quiet, punctuated only by the distant lapping of the bay water. Following Alara's directions, they found the dilapidated signal box. Beside it, a single newly run electrical conduit snaked across the frozen ground, disappearing beneath the rusted foundation of the largest derelict building, Warehouse 54. That's it, Alara breathed, her voice barely audible. That conduit is fresh. He's inside. Valerius cut the engine. The dynamic had reversed. He was the brute force, the wealth, the power, but she was the eyes, the history, the intelligence. They had arrived at the precipice of the conflict, an alliance forged in desperation, facing a threat born from the cold, ruthless choices of Valerius's past. The silence inside the sedan was a different kind of torture than the noise of his compound. Here, parked across the street from the grim bulk of Warehouse 54, the quiet was absolute, broken only by the shuddering breaths of the idling engine and the rhythmic lapping of the bay water. Valerius killed the headlights, plunging the car into shadow. The warehouse was inert, a giant coffin in the winter night, yet he knew his daughters were inside. He should have been running through tactical scenarios, assessing entry points, and calculating the risk of an armed assault. Instead, he was paralyzed by the single, devastating realization. He had driven his children into this danger. His protection had been an illusion, layers of money, steel, and ruthless men. But it hadn't covered the real vulnerability, the debts of his past. "They're just babies, Alara," Valerius muttered, his gaze fixed on the corrugated iron wall of the warehouse, seeing not the metal, but the faces of Isla, Lyra, and Stella. "I hired 3 rotations of nurses and guards. They never left the main wing. I built them a life that was supposed to be safe." His voice broke on the last word, sounding foreign to his own ears. Alara didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, her hands still tightly folded in her lap. "I barely held them," he confessed, the admission wrenching itself out of him. "After the first month, I stopped going into the nursery often. I would watch them sleep through the glass wall, but I never picked them up unless it was absolutely necessary. I was afraid." He waited for her to ask what he was afraid of. She didn't. She waited, understanding the confession wasn't finished. "My first wife," he continued, the memory raw and unforgiving. "She left me, said my hands were too dirty, that the violence I managed would eventually taint anything I touched. She said if we had children, they would inherit the darkness. She was convinced I was a curse." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound exhaustion. "I believed her. So, I built a perfect, sterile world for the girls, a glass cage of safety. I kept my distance so my violence, my failures, my filth wouldn't bleed onto their innocence. I kept them safe by being cold." He looked at Alara, expecting revulsion, maybe judgment. Instead, Alara finally turned, her gaze soft yet firm. "Sir," she said, reverting to the formal address, yet giving the word a new, tender weight. "The world is dirty. You can't build a clean room around a life. You have to teach them how to wash their own hands." She reached out, and for the first time, her fingers brushed the rough wool of his sleeve. It wasn't a maid touching a boss, it was a human offering connection. "You were trying to protect them from the things you do, but the only thing they need protection from is the world thinking you don't love them. They'll be fine because of what you're doing right now. You gave up the one thing you said you'd never touch to find them. That is the kind of protection they need, Valerius, the kind that is present." Her words were a simple balm, penetrating the steel armor of his self-condemnation. He was Valerius Thorn, the boss who sacrificed his empire for his daughters, not the monster who feared his own touch. In the desolate silence of the warehouse district, the rigid walls around his heart finally began to collapse, not with a bang, but with the quiet realization that he had misunderstood the nature of his own strength. He was a father, and that vulnerability was the key. The waiting stretched the silence into something taut and unbearable. Valerius checked his watch, a heavy platinum chronometer that usually dictated the tempo of 100 cities, but now meant nothing against the unpredictable ticking of a madman's clock. Alara sat perfectly still beside him, her presence a curious mixture of strain and solidarity. The encrypted text came at 2:00 a.m., searing through the dark like a bullet. It wasn't from Vetti, but from a proxy server Valerius instantly recognized as Silvio's preferred route, a dead-drop email, designed to destroy itself after one viewing. Valerius opened the attachment first. It was a video file, 15 seconds long, no sound. The video was shot in a cold, dim space, Warehouse 54. The frame centered on the triplets. Isla, Lyra, and Stella were bundled tightly in thick, cheap blankets, lying side by side on what looked like an old canvas cot. They weren't crying. They weren't even awake. They were simply breathing, their faces pale and serene under the flickering beam of a bare light bulb. Their small chests rose and fell in perfect, synchronized rhythm. The sight broke Valerius truly. He saw the beautiful, quiet innocence he had tried so hard to safeguard, now exposed and vulnerable in the hands of a venomous enemy. He was shattered not by their distress, but by their obliviousness. They trusted the world to keep them safe, a trust he had failed to uphold. He closed the file, the silence in the car ringing with the echo of his own gasp. Next, he opened the message. It was brief, written in Silvio's familiar, mocking prose. Thorn, you took 5 years of my life, my reputation, and my future. A few million doesn't cover the debt. The payment is not monetary. It is existential. You will immediately and publicly transfer the deed to the Pinnacle Tower to the shell corporation listed below. It must be finalized and announced by 8 o'clock a.m. Failure means the children sleep forever. P.S. Your little ledger trade was pointless. I already have a copy. The demand hit Valerius with the force of a physical blow. The Pinnacle Tower. It wasn't just a building, it was the keystone of his legitimate holdings, his crown jewel, the massive skyscraper that provided the financial cover for all his illegal operations. Losing it wouldn't just cost him millions. It would expose a critical gap in his revenue stream, invite government scrutiny, and potentially trigger a cascade failure that could collapse his entire empire, sending him to prison for life. Silvio wasn't seeking revenge, he was seeking destruction. Ilara had watched his face as he read the message, seeing the internal battle rage behind his eyes. "What does he want, Valerius?" she asked, her voice low and steady. He forced himself to meet her gaze, the decision already made, the choice crystal clear in the wake of seeing his daughters breathe. "He wants the Pinnacle Tower," Valerius stated, his voice flat with finality. "He wants my freedom, my control, my everything." He reached for the communications console, his fingers flying across the satellite phone keypad to call his head of legal, waking the poor man with the command to prepare the immediate transfer of the single most important asset in the Thorn organization. The line of choice was drawn. On one side, safety, wealth, and continued freedom. On the other, Isla, Lyra, and Stella. Valerius looked again at the frozen image of their resting faces on the screen. The empire was meaningless. The life he had built was a hollow structure without them. "I choose the children," he whispered to Ilara, not needing her permission or her understanding, but needing a witness to the profound, irreversible choice that sealed his fate. The boss had signed his own death warrant, trading his kingdom for 3 small lives. They would have the tower. They would not touch his daughters. Valerius approached Warehouse 54 on foot, the thick folder containing the notarized transfer deeds to the Pinnacle Tower held loosely in one hand. He wore no armor, no weapons beyond the familiar weight of the automatic holstered beneath his coat, a move designed to signal compliance while keeping the final variable open. Ilara had insisted on staying behind, hidden in the sedan across the street. She argued that 2 targets were more dangerous than 1, but Valerius knew she was planning something, her eyes too bright with a fierce, protective calculation. He kicked open the rusty side door of the warehouse. The air inside was freezing, stagnant, and reeked of brine and dried dust. A single, naked bulb hung from the ceiling, casting deep, erratic shadows. Silvio Corsi stood in the center of the cavernous space, flanked by 3 men, 2 of whom Valerius recognized as former loyalists. Silvio was leaner than Valerius remembered, his face etched with 5 years of bitterness, but his eyes held the same glittering mania. "Valerius Thorn," Silvio purred, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "Look how easily the boss surrenders his crown. I knew those little girls were the key, the perfect, unspoiled weakness." Valerius stepped fully into the light, letting the glare expose his face, his focus unshakable. "The deeds are here." Where are the children? Silvio laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Always rushing to the finale, Val. You think this is a transaction? You think giving up a building wipes the slate clean? You ruined me. You stole my life, humiliated me in front of the whole circuit. You left me with nothing but the memory of how easy it was to hate you. He gestured to a small, makeshift area behind him, partitioned by stacked cargo pallets. They're sleeping. Peacefully. Just as they were when your pathetic security guard was taking his usual nap. The trade is made, Valerius insisted, his hand tightening on the folder. The tower is yours. Give me my daughters. Silvio took a step forward, his smile fading into something genuinely terrifying. You misunderstand, old friend. The tower was the price to see them. The payment for taking them is watching you break. I didn't steal them to get rich. I stole them to watch you feel the hollow space I've been living in. You can have the tower. You can have your freedom. But you will never have them back. It was the ultimate betrayal. The ultimate cruelty. Valerius's world narrowed to a single, white-hot point of rage. Silvio's words confirmed his flaw. His coldness had not saved him. It had created a monster intent on vengeance. Just as Valerius lunged, driven by pure protective instinct, the world exploded into chaos. First, the single flickering overhead light died with a sudden, deafening pop. The warehouse plunged into absolute blackness. Then, milliseconds later, an air raid siren, the ancient, long-forgotten kind used for dock warnings, screamed to life directly outside the warehouse wall, its sound piercing and disorienting. Alara. The diversion was crude, loud, and immediate. Silvio and his men were instantly unbalanced, shouting, their guns coming up blindly. Valerius didn't hesitate. He knew the layout of his enemy's body, the trajectory, the reaction time. He moved on sound and memory, tackling Silvio into the stacked pallets. His automatic was drawn and pressed to Silvio's throat before the air raid siren could complete its first painful rotation. Shut up! Valerius snarled into Silvio's ear, the raw fear on the other man's face the only light he needed. Where are they? Tell me, or I pull the trigger, and the tower is worthless to you. The threat worked. Choking on the dust and terror, Silvio gasped the coordinates. Valerius, using the muffled location, delivered a precise, incapacitating blow to Silvio's temple, silencing him. He moved immediately to the cargo pallets, ignoring the rising commotion of Silvio's remaining men, who were scrambling in the dark. He found a hidden break in the pallets and located a small wooden crate. Inside, bundled together like 3 small doves, were Isla, Lyra, and Stella. He secured the crate, his heart slamming against his ribs, and began his retreat into the screaming darkness, carrying his entire world in his hands. Valerius scrambled away from the pallets, the heavy wooden crate containing the triplets tucked tight against his chest. The shrieking siren, Alara's gift, was his cover. It masked the sounds of his movements and, crucially, disoriented the remaining enemies. He plunged into the deeper shadows of the warehouse, moving with the brutal efficiency of a man who suddenly had everything to lose. He didn't fire a single shot, dedicating both hands and all his attention to the precious, fragile cargo. He reached the egress door, the one Alara had pointed out, and burst into the night air. Across the street, the sedan's lights flashed once, Alara confirming his exit. He didn't run. He walked with a determined, steady pace, carrying the container like a sacred trust. Once safely in the back seat of the car, Alara was already moving, stripping off her maid apron, which she'd used to muffle the siren's internal switch. She immediately turned her attention to the crate, her fingers finding the latch. Valerius watched, his breathing ragged, his hands still vibrating from the blow that took down Silvio. The crate opened. Valerius reached in and gently, awkwardly, lifted out the first child. It was Isla, recognizable by the tiny scar above her eyebrow. She was warm, heavy, and smelled faintly of baby powder and cheap blanket wool. He had never held her this long before. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her weight, the solidness of her existence, grounded the swirling chaos in his head. Then he lifted Lyra, her body small and perfect, and finally Stella, the lightest of the 3. He sat on the black leather seat, surrounded by the weight and warmth of his daughters, his suit smeared with warehouse grime. This was true wealth. This was everything the Pinnacle Tower was not. "Silvio," Valerius finally said, his voice flat. "He's unconscious. 2 others were with him. We need to secure them." "Your men will handle the cleanup," Alara stated, her voice calm and absolute as she checked each girl for injuries. "Silvio tried to shoot you. He is a threat to the family. What is his fate?" Valerius looked down at the pale, serene face of Lyra against his expensive tie. "He wants my suffering. He wants me to feel the hollow space of loss. To kill Silvio would be easy. It would satisfy the boss. But to sentence him to a living, hollow hell, that was a colder, more fitting justice. "Take them alive," Valerius ordered, the decision firm. "Take them to the old detention house on the outskirts. No one touches them. They will live the rest of their lives watching the Thorn Empire continue without them. No execution, no martyrdom, just endless, rotting irrelevance." It was a transformation in his ruthlessness, a targeted sentence of isolation, reflective of his own internal suffering. Back at the estate, as the first hint of sickly dawn touched the horizon, Valerius walked into the nursery. The 3 empty cribs stood like silent white monuments. The maid's uniform lay discarded on a chair. Valerius stood there, surrounded by the silence, holding his daughters. The house felt like a cold, ornate shell, a fortress built to keep the world out, but which had nearly kept him from the only thing that mattered. He found Alara in the kitchen, washing blood from her dress where she had grazed herself during the scramble to deploy the siren. "From now on," Valerius said, his voice quiet, authority undiminished but fundamentally altered. "You are not the maid. You are the family guardian. Your salary triples. You answer only to me. Your job is not cleaning this house, Alara. It is securing the lives within it. This house is no longer a fortress. It is their home. And I need someone who knows what that means." He handed her an encrypted keycard. "You have access to everything. You earned it tonight. You saved us all." Alara looked at the key, then at him, a rare, small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Understood, Valerius. The house will be a home." 3 months later, the nursery was still the grand, high-ceilinged room it had always been, but it felt fundamentally different. It was loud, chaotic, and permeated by the warm, earthy smell of formula and clean linen. Valerius sat on the plush rocking chair, his expensive Italian leather replaced by a worn suede cushion, holding Lyra against his chest. Her small hand was curled around his index finger. The stark tattoos on his forearm, usually symbols of fear and control, were now just the backdrop for the most profound vulnerability he had ever experienced. He was wearing a high-end cashmere sweater and slacks, a concession to comfort over armor. His phone, which had buzzed incessantly for the last hour, lay face down on the end table. It was his head of operations, furious about a delay on the Eastern Bloc acquisition, a deal that 3 months ago would have consumed his entire focus. Now, it was an irritant, a distant, muffled noise. He was late for the video conference, but the deals could wait. Lyra's tiny weight was more real than the millions lost on the Pinnacle Tower. The fierce, desperate love he had tapped into during the retrieval had solidified, hardening into a quiet, protective core. True power wasn't measured in the height of buildings or the depth of fear he commanded. It was measured in the perfect, trusting rhythm of Lyra's breath against his chest. He was less of a boss, perhaps, but exponentially more of a man. The sacrifices he had made, the ledger, the tower, the exposure, were nothing compared to the richness of this single, ordinary moment. The door opened quietly. Alara entered. No longer in her maid's uniform, but in dark, tailored clothes that spoke of authority and immediate action. She carried a basket of freshly laundered sleep suits. She was the family guardian, the children's shadow, the only staff member Valerius truly trusted now. Her presence was a constant, silent acknowledgement of what they had endured together. She glanced at the phone, then at Valerius, a wry half-smile touching her lips. Mr. Novak is preparing a seizure action on the new acquisition, Valerius. He sounds close to tears. Valerius shrugged, a gesture he would never have permitted himself 3 months ago. Tell him to send Novak a new acquisition. The one I have right here is more valuable. Alara approached the rocking chair, her gaze sweeping over the serene faces of the 3 girls, who were now stirring. Isla blinked, followed by Stella, and Lyra stirred in Valerius's arms. Alara knelt, meeting Valerius's eyes with a shared history that transcended their past roles. She hadn't been the one to ask the terrible question, but she had been the one to witness his disintegration and transformation. The triplets were fully awake now, gazing up at the 2 adults who had fought the darkness for them. They woke up, Alara, Valerius whispered, his voice thick with a profound, final understanding. He didn't mean just the triplets, who were now blinking into the dawn light. He meant the dormant part of his heart, the fierce, unconditional self he had denied for decades. We all finally did, Alara confirmed, her eyes reflecting the quiet certainty of their shared, hard-won peace.